On May 4, 1945, the battered Tangamunda Bridge over the Ella River stood as the final viable passage. Twisted iron girders creaked beneath the burden of multitudes, while Wehrmacht troops picked their way along the mangled fragments of a once sleek structure. Blasted apart by withdrawing Wehrmacht troops on April 12th, it had transformed into a fragile conduit. A narrow trail of fractured slabs and warped steel stretched across the bend. U.S. intelligence picked up a transmission in the 102nd Infantry Division's area. Wehrmacht detachments were pulling back from every stronghold. A massive exodus was spotted heading toward U.S. positions. Roughly 100,000 troops and non-combatants were pushing west via the ruined setup. Captain William Patterson from the 405th Infantry Regiment set down his binoculars and gazed at the unending procession of people pouring over the ruined span. U.S. troops had advanced to the Elbe a fortnight prior, securing their spots per the Yoltar Accords. No one among the Allied strategists had foreseen that this impaired waterway link would turn into the epicenter of the biggest mass capitulation by armed forces in the West's annals. The desperation propelling the Wehrmacht stemmed from a reckoning deeper than tactical maneuvers. The odds of perishing in Soviet detention clashed against the likelihood of enduring under U.S. control. Reports pouring into Chaff Command sketched a stunning scene. Wehrmacht elements weren't merely falling back, they were ditching fortifications, wrecking their gear if it hindered progress, and clashing with SS units assigned to block their path. The Wehrmacht, formerly the continent's tightest-knit war apparatus, was crumbling into a torrent of individuals surging toward a sole goal: U.S. positions along the Ela River's far side. By the end of April 1945, the survival math had sharpened to a harsh edge. Wehrmacht spies had snagged Soviet signals, exposing expected losses for captured personnel. Out of every 100 Wehrmacht captives taken by the Red Army, estimates indicated under 40 would make it back alive. Reality would turn out far grimmer. The battlefield dynamics were irreparable. 8 million German non-combatants were streaming west from East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania. Trailing them, Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front were smashing the remnants of structured Wehrmacht opposition with crushing might. 20 Soviet divisions countered each still-fighting German one. The Red Army pushed forward 30 kilometers each day. Refugee lines covered 10 kilometers at best on favorable stretches. The end was unavoidable. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel's last tactical review, seized post-surrender, featured one bolded order: as many Wehrmacht units as possible needed to hit Western Allied fronts ahead of full Soviet closure. This reflected not cowardice, but grasp of an unyielding truth. Yielding to Americans offered strong odds of living. Soviet seizure, by contrast, spelled likely doom. The Yalta Pact had outlined control sectors, yet Wehrmacht leaders were wagering on a key detail. American units had paused at the Ela River, honoring pacts with their Soviet partners. Should Wehrmacht groups ford that stream prior to the Red Army's eastern approach, they'd fall into U.S. hands. The contest was no bid for triumph or armistice, but a raw fight for the slim chance of outlasting imprisonment. U.S. contingents guarding the Elbe's western shore boasted unmatched supply dominance, vital for managing the impending wave. Every infantry unit included provost companies, field messes able to nourish 15,000 daily portable hospitals with operating theaters, and enormous reserves showcasing U.S. manufacturing prowess. Major James Morrison, the 102nd Infantry Division's planning chief, had reviewed large-scale yield operations following the Ruhr Pocket in mid-April, where 325,000 Germans laid down arms. His estimates were grim. Handling 1,000 detainees demanded 3 tons of rations per day, 5,000 gallons of H2O, health checks for typhus and dysentery, sanitization posts, and paperwork yielding 12 documents each. Geneva protocols required precise nutrition, 2,800 calories for laborers, 2,000 for idlers. These figures weren't mere data points. They separated structure from anarchy amid throngs of frantic souls. Wehrmacht arrivals at the Elbe embodied the Army's total breakdown. Crack Waffen SS formations retained working Tiger tanks and advanced radio gear. Standard infantry outfits had shrunk to company size, armed solely with sidearms. Volkssturm groups, including lads of 14 and seniors past 60, carried just badges and antiquated WWI muskets. Trailing them, the arrival of support units, including organizational labor battalions from TOT, Luftwaffe ground staff lacking planes, naval crews displaced from ruined harbors, and women in auxiliary roles who endured unique terrors if seized by Soviet troops. Estimates from intelligence reports pegged the German troops east of the Elbe at around 1.2 million by April 25, 1945. Among them, 300,000 formed coherent fighting groups. Another 400,000 served in logistical capacities, while 500,000 consisted of dispersed Wehrmacht and Volkssturm fighters already heading west. What truly mattered was the pace of relocation. Soviet armored vanguards pushed forward at 50 kilometers per day. Foot-slogging German formations achieved just 30 kilometers in the best scenarios. The chance for retreat narrowed to mere hours. The initial clear sign emerged on April 20, 1945, as General Walter Wenck got Hitler's directive to strike toward Berlin using his 12th Army. Yet Wenck opted for a pivotal choice that preserved countless lives. Opting against squandering his troops in a pointless push against the Soviet ring around Berlin, he directed his command to secure a pathway for evacuation to the American front. From his base close to Belitz, Wenck convened his officers. "Fellow officers," he declared, "the conflict is over, lost. Our responsibility shifts from a failed doctrine to those still alive. Our troops and the non-combatants relying on our protection. We will advance, but to the west, carving a route to the Americans." This move reflected not fear, but deliberate compassion. Wenck's intel chief, Colonel Günther Reichhelm, had assembled grim data from areas under Soviet control. In East Prussia by itself, roughly 300,000 non-combatants perished amid the Red Army's push due to direct fighting, retaliatory executions, and widespread sexual assaults. Scaling those figures to the people now caught between the Elbe and the oncoming Soviets suggested losses potentially reaching millions. By April 24th, U.S. forward scouts noted bizarre sights. German convoys neared the Elbe without proper intervals, lights fully on against standard battlefield rules. Wehrmacht detachments showed up in orderly columns. Their leaders upheld discipline amid the rout. These were no chaotic mobs, but disciplined outfits opting for imprisonment instead of ongoing combat. Captain Robert Thornton, leading a recon platoon in the 2nd Armored Division, contacted his command post by radio. Approaching German elements pose no threat to us. They're waving white banners and seeking surrender conditions. Soon after, what started as a stream turned into a torrent. The U.S. 9th Army handled 3,000 willing capitulations on April 24th, 7,000 the next day, and 15,000 on April 26th. These involved no battlefield seizures, but intentional yields from formations with ample munitions and combat readiness. The Ruhr Pocket's collapse earlier that month set the pattern. When Field Marshal Walter Model disbanded Army Group B without official capitulation, 325,000 Germans turned themselves over to U.S. troops. The care they encountered, meals, health care, safeguards against vengeful refugees, circulated rapidly via Wehrmacht networks. U.S. signal intercepts captured striking exchanges among German commands. On April 27th, the 3rd Panzer Corps leader broadcast, "Americans upholding Geneva protocols at every assembly site, health care available, rations being handed out as reported." That element proved vital. Wehrmacht units had endured near-famine allotments for weeks. The mental shift hit hard and fast. Formations that battled with zeal for 6 years now fixated solely on attaining American positions. Sergeant Wilhelm Becke from the 21st Panzer Division recounted afterward, "Rumors said the Americans nourished captives, treated the ill, spared injured foes. In the grind of absolute war, such mercy felt unreal. Still, we hurried toward it." However, attaining those lines demanded enduring a perilous barrier. SS enforcement squads carried mandates to kill any retreating without clearance. Provost units set up barriers along every westward route, repelling or executing those branded as quitters. The SS clung to zealous devotion as the Reich crumbled, seeing yield as treason over mere endurance. The Halbe Clash, spanning April 24 to May 1, stood as the grimmest illustration of the westbound exodus's toll on lives. General Theodor Busse's Ninth Army, hemmed in southeast of Berlin, included 200,000 troops and 40,000 civilians. Hitler commanded them to battle east to join Berlin's garrison. Busse, however, linked efforts with Wenck to thrust west toward U.S. forces. The dash kicked off at 2,000 hours on April 25th. Frontrunners from the 11th SS Panzer Corps burned their final fuel stocks to breach Soviet defenses near Halbe village. Trailing was a staggering column, fighting squads, aid teams, office workers. The procession included tunnel survivors, ordinary civilians fleeing for their lives, family members of soldiers, and even military bands clutching their instruments amid the chaos. This vast line of people wound for 30 kilometers across the Spree forest, forming a twisting horde of desperate souls trudging over marshy ground and dense timber. The Red Army responded with devastating force. Katyusha rocket launchers unleashed barrages into the jammed formations. Il-2 Sturmovik planes raked the ground with machine gun fire at any sign of motion. T-34 tanks smashed through barricades and overran the defenders holding them. What was once a woodland turned into a scene of carnage. Corpses accumulated at creek fords, where Soviet gunners enjoyed clear lines of sight for their volleys. Injured troops unable to continue were left behind right where they collapsed. Colonel Hans von Luck, leading the shattered remains of a panzer regiment, captured the nightmare in his account. This had ceased to resemble combat. It was pure butchery. Russian guns transformed woodland trails into kill zones. We pressed on solely because halting guaranteed annihilation. I witnessed commanders executing their own casualties to spare them from Soviet hands. The toll was devastating. From the initial 200,000 attempting escape, only about 40,000 made it to Wenck's defenses and subsequent U.S. imprisonment. The Halbe Forest Memorial Site now holds 24,000 burials, the majority labeled simply as unidentified Wehrmacht personnel. An additional 60,000 fell into Soviet custody, with scant few enduring their imprisonment. The rest disappeared entirely, slain in obscure clashes, swept away while fording rivers, or swallowed by the wood's vastness. General Wenck's 12th Army carried out one of the conflict's most extraordinary relief efforts. Ignoring Hitler's explicit command to push toward Berlin, Wenck opted to secure a 40-kilometer pathway from the Elbe River to the dispersed fragments of German troops encircled eastward. To his ranks, often youths fresh from academies or older Volkssturm reservists, he emerged as a symbol of unyielding resolve. He might have escaped, one trooper remembered afterward. High-ranking leaders were vanishing every day, racing west in official vehicles. But Wenck remained, and his presence kept us there too. The commander's strategic acumen shone in his setup of barriers. Instead of guarding a solid front, he fortified vital spots at highway intersections and water barriers, compelling Soviet formations to mount structured assaults rather than just chase. This granted vital hours to the fleeing groups, albeit with heavy losses among the guards. The ruined Tangermunde Bridge emerged as the evacuation's crux. Wehrmacht sappers had demolished the contemporary span on April 12th to hinder the U.S. push, yet now its mangled debris acted as the sole ford for 50 kilometers around. German army builders and U.S. field technicians collaborated from each side to reinforce the debris, fashioning a shaky one-lane trail over the water. The sites there broke every norm of warfare. Between May 4th and May 7th, roughly 100,000 individuals traversed the fractured span. Wehrmacht majors guided the flow beside American non-coms. German provost marshals enforced discipline on the inbound side as U.S. military police oversaw the outbound shore. Everyone grasped that disorder spelled ruin. A jammed passage would doom thousands with the Soviets closing in. Lieutenant Colonel William Davis from the 102nd Infantry Division recounted the bizarre alliance. Wehrmacht leaders offered salutes. We returned them. Their sappers requested tools from ours to bolster the span. We provided what they needed. All realized that keeping the ford clear was a matter of survival. The flow of humanity seemed boundless and gut-wrenching. A Wehrmacht colonel showed up with his full staff section and demanded a proper handover of his outfit standard. An SS commander arrived in ceremonial garb, seeking dignified detention for his command. A Navy skipper herded 200 infantrymen who hadn't glimpsed the sea in ages after being drafted into land battles. Women in support roles, including some just 17, pleaded with U.S. troops against repatriation eastward. The most heart-rending civilians made up the bulk of the throng. Relatives hauled possessions in strollers and carts. In the pandemonium, kids torn from their folks were handed over from one person to the next over the span. Frail seniors scarcely able to shuffle were borne by unfamiliar helpers. Ill patients from hospitals, including those bedridden, were rolled across by healthcare workers determined not to leave them behind. Master Sergeant James Patterson, overseeing the West Entry, recounted afterward. They arrived in surges, from sunrise to sunset, extending into the darkness under the moon's glow. Troops, arms in hand, would deposit them in heaps like firewood, mothers clutching infants. Youngsters who seemed elementary school age yet clad in Wehrmacht garb, seniors sporting Volkssturm bands. No one dashed frantically. No opposition arose. They simply expressed thanks for making it to our territory. The immense volume surpassed U.S. logistical capabilities. Rules under the Geneva Convention demanded detailed records for every captive, health checks, and sufficient meals plus housing. Handling one detainee correctly took 20 minutes. During the highest influx, 20,000 showed up each day. The setup buckled beneath the sheer volume. Colonel Benjamin Thompson, as top aide to the 18th Airborne Corps commander, issued a vital order. Ignore the forms, provide nourishment, cleanse them of parasites. Offer care to the injured. Records can be postponed. Human lives cannot. Such practical measures rescued countless individuals, but sparked bureaucratic disarray that endured for years. Kin groups got divided amid the turmoil, with some parted forever. Troops lost touch with their squads, hindering precise loss tallies. Potential offenders against war laws might have slipped through the crowd unnoticed. Still, rejecting the influx was inconceivable. The health emergency proved dire. Military health teams figured 30% of yielding Germans needed urgent aid. Widespread undernourishment stemmed from prolonged meager allotments. Lice-borne typhus risked exploding into outbreaks. Untended battle injuries from weeks prior had festered into gangrene. Field operation setups meant for scores of cases managed hundreds per day. Captain David Miller, a doctor in the 330th Medical Battalion, conducted operations non-stop for 72 hours. These injuries weren't recent battlefield ones. They were aged, contaminated, and neglected. Soldiers had limped on fractures, battled with fragments lodged inside. Female support staff bore unhealed harms from attacks. Offspring suffered such extreme starvation they could hardly remain upright. Logistics tested even U.S. plentiful resources. One foot soldier unit toted supplies for 15,000 troops over 7 days. Come May 5th, they sustained 60,000 captives alongside countless non-combatants. Urgent supply lines operated around the clock from back warehouses. C-47 planes released provisions via chutes. The Red Ball Express, once fueling Patton's dash through France, revived to nourish the yielded foes. At Chef Command, General Dwight Eisenhower confronted an untenable bind. Yalta Pacts spelled it out clearly. German troops had to yield to every Allied power at once. Isolated capitulations to the west while clashing with the Soviets breached joint commitments. Nevertheless, the disaster in human terms was stark. On May, traverse the Elbe prior to midnight on May 8th or endure Soviet detention. General Omar Bradley, leading the 12th Army Group, stated in later testimony, "We recognized our actions. We took yields we weren't formally allowed to, managed foes still battling our partners, but we also grasped Soviet imprisonment's horrors. At times, compassion outweighs procedure." From May 4th through May 8th, the days brimmed with desperate fervor. Aware of the approaching official end, German outfits shed all military discipline. Fighters discarded gear to hasten their flight. Leaders torched papers to avoid hindering escape. Whole brigades disintegrated as personnel chose solo westward dashes. The impaired Tangamunda Passage functioned without pause. Even once Soviet troops arrived at Artil on May 6th, the influx of refugees persisted across the Elbe River. U.S. Commanders directed their gunners to deliver suppressive barrages, effectively clashing with Red Army units to shield the Germans advancing to yield. This episode ranked among the conflict's most bizarre episodes, with U.S. and German elements working in tandem even as formal hostilities lingered. Precisely at Zaire 241 on May 7th, General Alfred Jodl formally endorsed Germany's total capitulation in Reims. The truce was set to activate at 23:01 hours on May 8th, granting German troops a precise 45-hour window to attain U.S. positions. Thus commenced the most urgent pursuit in wartime annals. The ensuing events eluded standard tactical labels. It transcended mere withdrawal or capitulation, resembling instead an armed mass exodus. Reports indicated that around 250,000 Wehrmacht members still lingered east of the Elbe as of May 7th. Over those 45 hours, roughly 180,000 managed to link up with American forces. The remainder fell into Soviet hands, facing dire fates. General Walther Wenck's concluding maneuver embodied chivalric resolve amid rout. His 12th Army safeguarded its pathway right up to the brink, permitting survivors from the 9th Army and vast numbers of non-combatants to slip away. Wenck deployed his remaining functional armored vehicles and batteries to repel Soviet advances as the flight pressed on. At 1800 hours on May 7th, Wenck relayed his closing directive. The 12th Army has discharged its ultimate obligation. We have preserved everyone within our power. Each officer may now pursue refuge for his unit. Rather than capitulation, this constituted a discharge from command, empowering his troops to decide their paths. Wenck was himself among the final crossers, traversing a wrecked rail span near Tangermunde at 0200 hours on May 8th, scarcely 21 hours shy of the armistice. In his wake, Soviet armor was already infiltrating sites vacated by his forces mere hours prior. From his starting force of 200,000, about 100,000 attained U.S. lines. Through his refusal to heed Hitler's mandates, an additional 250,000 ordinary Germans were rescued. Personal accounts underscored the profound anguish involved. Luftwaffe pilot Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann piloted his Messerschmitt Bf 109 westward until the tanks emptied, opting for a forced landing in a U.S.-held pasture over venturing into Red Army domain. U-boat skipper Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock navigated his vessel upstream along the Elbe to its limit, then sank it and guided his submariners on foot toward American outposts. A Wehrmacht physician remained behind with immobilized critical casualties, aware it ensured Soviet internment, offering simply, "Duty demands tending to the immobile." A young infantryman yielded his spot on a jammed lorry to an aged resident, then set out on the 100-kilometer trek to U.S. territory. He showed up 18 hours past the truce's start, nominally belated yet compassionate American sentries granted entry. The Rhine meadow enclosures served as gathering hubs for this torrent of humanity. These makeshift pens, frequently mere fenced farmlands, accommodated more than 1 million German detainees by May 15th. Hardships abounded yet proved endurable, a stark contrast to Soviet facilities. Detainees at first lacked any cover beyond self-dug pits. Rations started at 1,200 calories per day, rising with logistical gains. Hydration drew from streams and jury-rigged conduits. Hygiene facilities were rudimentary. Illnesses proliferated amid the throngs. Still, mortality hovered under 1% versus 35% or worse in Bolshevik holdings. Colonel James Foster, overseeing Camp Remagen, confronted immense strains. Intended for 100,000, it crammed in 184,000 by May 12th. SS officers mingled with ideological foes. Adolescent Hitler Youth shared space with battle-hardened Eastern Front survivors. Women in support roles needed segregated quarters, and sailors unused to terrestrial fighting. Pandemonium reigned under control, yet discipline held and lives were sustained. Intake procedures exposed the utter disintegration of the Wehrmacht. Certain formations presented full records for precise logging. Others lacked any papers save oral identities. The formidable 16th Panzer Division trickled in with just 312 survivors from a roster of 14,000. The 246th Volksgrenadier Division amounted to 89 senior citizens. Sorting defied logic. Did Hitler Youth qualify as combatants or minors, support women as troops or non-combatants? Volkssturm as fighters or conscripted folk? U.S. officials leaned toward mercy, registering everyone as POWs eligible for Geneva safeguards. The composition of the escaping German units crystallized as Soviet zones unveiled their horrors. Post-1991 disclosures from NKVD archives validated the Teutonic apprehensions. From some 3 million Germans seized by Soviets, no fewer than 1.1 million perished in bonds. Fatality ratios in 1945 and 1946 topped 50% across numerous sites. Factors intertwined, Soviet supply chains strained to feed their ranks, ignoring hordes of captives. Wehrmacht inmates got 600 to 800 calories daily, woefully inadequate for survival conditions in the gulags demanded grueling forced labor. Healthcare was almost entirely absent. Epidemics of typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis raged without restraint. Winters in Siberia plunged to 40°C, with inmates lacking proper attire or housing. Worse than the physical hardships was the organized cruelty. Soviet overseers, many grieving relatives killed by German war crimes, extended scant compassion. Detainees toiled in unprotected uranium shafts, timber operations burdened by unattainable targets, and building sites where hazards went disregarded. The injured and ill were frequently executed as burdens. Ex-Soviet military man Viktor Astafyev recounted later, "Every deceased German served as recompense for our anguish, for Leningrad, Stalingrad, and the 27 million Soviet lives lost. Overseers vied to exhaust prisoners to their end quickest. Displaying pity equated to disloyalty toward our perished allies." The data painted a grim picture. U.S. documentation indicated that among 3.8 million German captives held in the West, roughly 137,000 perished, yielding a 3.6% fatality rate. Many fatalities stemmed from injuries sustained prior to surrender or illnesses amid the conflict's turbulent close. By June 1945, monthly mortality in U.S. facilities had dropped to 0.15%. Even sanitized Soviet accounts exposed disaster. Official Soviet tallies admitted 357 German POW deaths, though German investigations suggest the actual figure surpassed 1 million. The Mashka Commission recorded that among those captured in 1945, under 50% lived to see 1950. Disparities sharpened for certain categories. Waffen-SS troops endured a mere 20% survival chance in Soviet facilities compared to 95% under American control. Women serving in auxiliary roles suffered routine sexual violence in Soviet hands, whereas U.S. authorities typically freed them soon after. Hitler Youth adolescents faced instant execution by Soviets as ideological zealots, but Americans treated them as young offenders needing reform over retribution. The widespread capitulation to U.S. troops in 1945 reshaped Europe's aftermath. Allied forces from America and Britain oversaw most remaining German soldiers, granting vital espionage edges as the Cold War dawned. Operation Paperclip thrived in part due to specialists intentionally yielding to Americans. Werner von Braun's missile group trekked 500 kilometers across disintegrating defenses to join U.S. ranks. "We loathe the French, dread the Soviets, doubt the British can sustain us, only the Americans remain," von Braun informed his team. His choice propelled the U.S. to lunar success years on. Demographically, the toll proved devastating. East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania saw their fighting-age male populations nearly wiped out, slain in battle, escaped westward, or vanished in Soviet detention. Whole lineages vanished. The German Democratic Republic grappled for generations with skewed sex ratios from such massive male losses. The mental scars endured across eras. Kin split by the intra-German divide frequently linked their rift to May 1945's chaos. Some attained American sectors, others ensnared in Soviet territories. Fate's randomness, hinging on which force seized you, etched itself as a core post-war German wound. At 231 hours on May 8, 1945, as the armistice activated, U.S. units had handled about 1.5 million German servicemen in the conflict's last 3 weeks. The 102nd Infantry Division took in 313,000 surrenders alone, outnumbering the full German force that struck Poland in 1939. The closing figures stunned witnesses at the time. The U.S. Ninth Army logged 423s and captives from April 20th to May 8th. The First Army managed 387 Ahornshit. Reviews revealed under 20,000 came via direct clashes. The majority yielded on their own, sometimes battling past comrades to arrive. General Omar Bradley reflected afterward, "We geared for triumph, not this influx." The German military didn't merely capitulate, it unraveled. Soldiers who battled with fervor for 6 years abruptly sought only our positions. They grasped, as we discovered soon enough, what yielding to us promised: survival. Falling to Soviets likely spelled doom. The count swelled post-armistice, too. From May 8 to May 31, an additional 874,000 German troops slipped into Western Allied zones from Soviet-held ground, via evasion, bureaucratic mix-ups, or lenient enforcement of timelines by U.S. and British commands. Personal accounts illuminated the raw humanity in these figures. Corporal Friedrich Müller, who gave himself up at Tangermünde on May 5th, maintained a journal during his internment. "First day free of terror in 6 years. Americans handed out loaves, genuine bread, no ersatz filler. A sentry shared a smoke. I wept. After our horrors, why handle us with dignity?" Nurse Hildegard Schneider forded the Elbe alongside a field hospital detachment. "We carried 300 wounded Americans, accepted every one of them, including SS personnel. U.S. physicians worked tirelessly overnight, rescuing wounded German troops." A doctor remarked to me, "The conflict has ended. We're simply healers now, and you're merely those in need of care." It stunned me that such compassion could endure. Wehrmacht Private Hans Bauer, only 17 years old, later recounted, "I'd heard tales that Americans would torment captives, and that yielding meant shame, but they handed me chocolate instead. It had been 3 years since I'd tasted any." A medic tended to my festering injury. An officer inquired if I could reach my mother. They regarded me not as a foe, but as a youth compelled into battle. Ex-SS officer Wilhelm Hartung, bracing for death, got medical aid for his injuries and was ultimately freed. I felt unworthy of such kindness. My outfit had perpetrated horrific deeds. Still, the Americans adhered to justice rather than retaliation. That clemency lingered in my mind far more than any penalty might have. General Walter Wendt outlived the war, passing in 1982. During a 1975 discussion, he pondered those frantic times. I defied Hitler's directives and would repeat it without hesitation. My obligation lay with the living souls I led, not some perished doctrine. Each fighter we ferried over the river marked a success. Every innocent spared counted as a win. We forfeited the conflict, yet in its closing moments, we preserved whatever lives possible. Wendt showed no remorse for his rebellion. Hitler demanded we offer our lives for his delusional Reich dream. I opted to protect my troops for their loved ones and for Germany's tomorrow. Faced with honor versus compassion, I selected compassion. Let history decide my correctness. His decisions spared roughly 250,000 troops and non-combatants from Soviet imprisonment. Numerous survivors and their kin convene each year on May 8th to commemorate Wendt, dubbing him the commander who favored existence over demise, kindness over dogma. The widespread German capitulation to U.S. troops in April and May 1945 went beyond mere battlefield defeat. It embodied a vast relief effort, a crumbling of beliefs, and in essence, a tribute to compassion's might amid war's bleakest phase. This episode upended conventional accounts. German units didn't merely cease combat upon command, they deliberately pursued U.S. custody as deliverance. The regimented Wehrmacht of 1940 had devolved into a frantic horde by 1945, ready to stake all to evade Soviet reprisal. For U.S. personnel, the ordeal marked a profound shift. Inexperienced fighters who had battled throughout Europe abruptly shifted to aiding former adversaries who had sought their lives just days prior. The adept management of this deluge, amid vast crowds and supply strains, showcased American efficiency and innate benevolence. Historian John Keegan observed years later, "The German rush toward U.S. positions in 1945 was without parallel. No prior instance saw such multitudes intentionally choose targeted detention while still able to resist. It showed that even in all-out conflict, personal assessments of leniency against reprisal could supersede creed and commands. The final German to traverse at Tangermünde was party affiliate Heinrich Fischer, 63 years old. He arrived at American outposts at 22:47 on May 8, 1945, precisely 14 minutes prior to the truce. Queried on his daring passage, he replied plainly, "I yearn to embrace my grandchildren once more." He succeeded. Countless others who couldn't make it to U.S. lines perished. Private First Class Joseph Martinez, involved in handling the yielding Germans, offered the deepest insight. They weren't truly yielding to us. They escaped a graver fate. We merely symbolized endurance. Any of us could have acted similarly in their shoes. The frantic German exodus to U.S. fronts in 1945 exposed core realities of combat and the human spirit. Amid mankind's grimmest clash, the divide between forgiveness and retribution, vitality and oblivion, boiled down to the uniform accepting your submission. For countless Germans in April and May 1945, that divide meant survival. Opting for American over Soviet detention wasn't about ease or preference. It concerned existence alone. The data was indisputable. Yielding to Western forces promised likely survival. Falling to Soviets foretold likely doom. The end tally was grim. Among those who submitted to Western allies, 96.4% endured their internment. Of those seized by Soviets, under 65% ever returned. These figures concealed personal sorrows and victories that molded lineages, societies, and countries for decades. Yet past the numbers stood a greater reality. The U.S. handling of this upheaval, nourishing foes, mending the hurt, upholding discipline amid the surge, proved that even after total war's toll, benevolence might triumph over spite. Youthful American troops, many grieving comrades felled by German arms, picked responsibility and integrity over grudge. The impaired bridge traversal. The bridge spanning theElle at Tangermünde transformed into far more than a mere crossing point. It evolved into a threshold separating existence from oblivion, compassion from reprisal, and the Western vision of triumph from the Soviet one. Individuals who traversed it prior to May 8, 1945, typically endured to reconstruct their personal worlds and their homeland. Those who failed to do so confronted prolonged torment in Soviet detention facilities, assuming they lived through it. This widespread capitulation highlighted the war's deepest paradox. The Wehrmacht, which had ignited the conflict as invaders pursuing Lebensraum in the Eastern Territories, concluded it as fugitives hurrying toward the West. The notion of a superior race crumbled into frantic souls driven solely by the instinct to persist. The Reich, proclaimed to endure for a millennium, persisted just 12 years, culminating in its troops hastening to yield to forces they had previously scorned as crumbling liberal regimes. For scholars of history, the occurrence provokes deep inquiries. Did the United States' reception of these submissions represent a pinnacle of benevolence or a breach of Allied pacts? In rescuing German troops from Soviet imprisonment, did it uphold righteousness or undermine it? Such dilemmas continue to spark discussion, yet the toll on human lives was incontestable. Its repercussions resonate to this day. The bond between Germany and America in the years following the war was deeply shaped by this act of clemency. West Germany's incorporation into NATO, its evolution into a democratic powerhouse, and its position as the United States' primary partner in Europe amid the Cold War all stemmed from recollections of American grace amid conquest. The final traversal of the Elbe stood as more than the war's conclusion. It marked the grandest wager on compassion in the annals of warfare, a frantic stake by vanquished foes that their victors would opt for empathy rather than retaliation. For the survivors who reached the other side, that wager yielded returns in the sole medium of true worth, their survival, and via them, the rebirth of a country destined to emerge from ruin as a pillar of democratic Europe. The ruined span at Tangermünde, through which countless souls shifted from peril to safety, was left unrestored. Yet, its remembrance persists as a tribute to a core reality of combat. Ultimately, success is gauged not by foes eliminated, but by souls preserved, not by reprisals exacted, but by forgiveness extended. This forms the ultimate insight from the German exodus toward American positions in 1945. Even within the era's most ruinous clash, compassion could eclipse animosity, leniency could overcome grudge, and vitality could supersede demise. For the vast multitudes who braved the Elbe during those frantic times, that decision altered everything. Their journey represented more than evasion of Soviet penalty. It signified a transition from an era dominated by absolute conflict and ethnic bigotry toward the promise of a renewed order founded on justice, empathy, and personal worth. The fact that so many staked their all to attain American fronts was no mere tactical occurrence, but a compelling affirmation of compassion's force in conquest. The narrative circles back to its origin, a battered bridge across the Elbe, where frantic adversaries turned into thankful captives, where U.S. troops emerged as unforeseen rescuers, and where the straightforward gesture of receiving capitulation affirmed humanity's potential for forgiveness amid its bleakest moments. That endures is the enduring inheritance of those harrowing days in 1945. Evidence that, even in the wake of total warfare, the decision between compassion and reprisal, between empathy and grudge, could shape not only personal destinies, but also the trajectory of countries and the verdict of posterity itself.